I want to start with setting the foundations and just think and kind of share how we think about establishing trusted data. Because at the end of the day, what are you buying Instron equipment for? It's for the data that's generated by the equipment. So it's really the utmost importance to trust the data that's coming out of the system and building up that trust through a number of different processes and practices. And one of those practices is around how we govern the data that's being produced and how we control access to it and protect the settings that are configured on the Instron. And so that's obviously going to involve Bluehill software, and that's where I want to touch on a number of features today. I'll be showing you some screenshots, showing you what it is, showing you how it can benefit data integrity. So we'll walk through those one by one, and we'll finish on some questions. So make sure to enter in your questions as we go so that I can get to those at the end. Uh, so this is a pyramid that kind of is demonstrating the foundations of trusted data. And I reviewed this in our last webinar. So in April, we had a session where I spoke through the Bluehill test setup, a number of different features within the method creation where you can get benefits of improving your data integrity. But if we start at the bottom, really what we're talking about here is, okay, make sure we're selecting the right testing equipment, the hardware that you originally purchased. Then we want to make sure we maintain that, sustain the performance of that equipment over time. The next level up, which we covered last time, was programming the equipment to do what you need it to do and then running those tests in a controlled manner. And then the next step, which is where we're going to be focusing this session, is governing that data that's being produced, making sure that the right people are doing what they're trained to do on the equipment, and that when data is uh, produced, whether that's results or whether it's the test methods and programs that are actually controlling the machine, telling it what to do, that those files are protected. Um, and then the number one, the top thing on the pyramid is that regardless of kind of all of your decisions and kind of configuration in the buckets below, that at the end of the day, we're relying on humans to do a lot of these things still. So there's going to be, of course, training required for the systems, the software, making sure that the processes in place that surround your Instron frame are all being abided by. So of course, training is still very important. Okay, so let's get to our first feature around security traceability within Bluehill software. And this is not something that's new, but it's something that I still find that I think is important to start off with. And that is Bluehill's ability to configure users and their permissions of what they can do within Bluehill software on the Instron machine. And so this requires users to log in when they approach the equipment, when they open up Bluehill. And depending on what an admin had done to configure what that user can do, they'll be allowed to do certain things. They won't be allowed to do other things depending on how it's been configured. That when you first get your Instron system and you're setting up Bluehill Universal software, that if you are creating security, you have a decision to make, and that's whether you want to use Bluehill security, where you're creating users that are native specifically to Bluehill. So you're creating users, assigning what they can and can't do, or you can choose to use Active Directory, where you're going to be users are going to be logging in with their Windows credentials and all of the permissions within Bluehill. You'll see that rather than defining a permission for each user for each permission, that each permission is going to be linked to a user group on your Active Directory domain. Um, but yeah, I'm starting here because this is the the most basic, the most simple approach as a very easy thing you can do to take the data integrity of your system up a level. And this is standard behavior, of course, within Bluehill software. Um, But it is pretty surprising to me sometimes how few of our customers have security set up. And it prevents them from doing quite a few things. And so, for instance, just knowing which user ran a particular test, if you need to go back to that record and understand what happened, you don't actually have the traceability of what user ran that test. Or if someone changed a file, if they changed a test method, that if users aren't logging in and out, then you don't know who's at that system at that time. So just understanding who's using the equipment, what they're doing, but then just trying to prevent activity that is inherently putting your data at risk. So a few examples that I have are allowing people who might not be trained to create methods and set up your test control and calculations, allowing them to do that unregulated definitely puts uh, the data that's being generated at risk. Similarly, if users are not trained to run tests, to set up your grips and fixtures and press start in a safe manner and something that where they know the expected behavior of that equipment and what's going to happen, that is a safety risk to them, to, of course, your equipment. And this last one is around just the ability to delete tests, to exclude tests, to overwrite tests uh, by saving as over an existing sample file. So some of these things can be done unintentionally. Some of these things could be done intentionally, but being able to set up security, just prevent uh, what you want to prevent, depending on what your policies are, is something that we highly recommend. So the second feature is a step up above just our standard security, and that is electronic approval. And so there's going to be a couple of different features here that require non-standard Bluehill Universal software. And so for this example, electronic approval, this does require our traceability option, which is an optional add-on. But what electronic approval is essentially they're integrated reviews and approvals of changes to your test methods, changes to your report templates. When you do produce and generate test results, when you're running samples, that those PDFs, reports that are generated, you can have sign off on those changes and those test results. And really, how can this help? That number one, if you do hone in on your methods, which are can be very important to maintain the validity of the test control and the calculations that are being applied when you're running tests, that just to prevent any unintended changes, this is an easy way to do that. That certainly you can have security in place, which you can say, okay, only these 3 or 4 people are allowed to edit methods. But then there's no second set of eyes that's checking what they're doing. So someone can easily make a mistake, not fully understand the change that they've made. Um, and then all of a sudden, uh, 3 or 4 weeks could go by of you using a method that was modified that hadn't been reviewed when that change was made. And there's just discrepancies in data. And you might realize that the last few weeks or months of tests were done incorrectly. And that's a story that we hear repeatedly getting reported back to our team. So this is one additional layer of protection where you can have at least a second set of eyes, maybe a third set of eyes sign off on a change that needs to be made to a validated method of yours. A lot of times, this type of approval is something that's already happening at labs that we work with. It's could be happening in a completely different business system where files are managed and approvals are made, and that's actually a pretty sufficient way of doing it. But a lot of times, it's just a manual process, physical sign off, physical filing, scanning that this change was made, that this particular user made this change, and actually doing a physical signature. Um, and so certainly having the integrated approvals within traceability is a more efficient uh, way to do this. And so just to quickly explain what we're looking at, that when you do have our traceability option, you'll see that there's a review kind of queue that's available. And in this first like left pane is where you'd see a list of anything that has been submitted for review. So in this case, a user, an operator named Oliver, ran a test, a PDF was generated, and that this system has been set up so that there's at least an additional review required on the test report. And so someone who has the ability to perform those reviews would be able to see this item, see the test that was run, and then either approve or reject the test itself. And so for PDF reports, we do have this nice electronic stamp that's applied physically to that file. Um, that if you are approving methods or report templates, other kind of Bluehill native files, that electronic signature is applied into the metadata of the file to make sure that you have the necessary approval before tests can be run. So that is kind of a little bit about our electronic approval. I think the one thing I will add in addition to what I've said is that this last uh, area is where you would be able to define what signatures are actually required. And so you can treat a test method different from a report template, different from your PDF report, whether you need any signatures at all, whether you just want the person making the change to be able to sign off and authenticate that change, or if you want one or two people to review. Okay, our third feature is if we move one screen down within our traceability offering. So this audit trail is something that again, requires traceability. And what the audit trail is simply just a historical log of the activity on the Instron. And so if you look here, that you'll have a chronological list of the most recent event down and downward of the activity at the system. So whether people are logging in and out, are modifying files, are performing reviews and signing things off, approving things, rejecting things, creating new files as you create methods, create samples, create PDFs, create CSV exports, that all of that file generation and modification is getting tracked in time in terms of when it happened, who did it. And if you select any particular entry, then you would be able to see all of the details associated to that revision of that newly created file or what have you. And so you are able to filter by the type of entry, by the date that um, maybe a date range. You want to look at the last month or last 6 months of data, and you would return all of the entries associated to that filter set. So this is the audit trail, and it's really just there when you need it. So it's kind of one good way I've recently heard about someone talking about traceability is you think about it like insurance, that it's not something that you're going to use every single day, most likely, that it's a lot of times it's there for protection. It's there when you need it. That whether it's you have a quarterly or annual kind of quality process to uh, track and record the activity on the system, and once a year you need to print out all of your audit entries, or if you have an auditor come on site and they're kind of quizzing you about your process's integrity, you can show them this capability that controls your testing processes and kind of allows you to see how the system is being used and who has access to it. Or maybe you're troubleshooting. Maybe you have some sort of data discrepancy and you want to understand the history of that sample, the history of the method that the sample was using, who had access to the system when the test was run, just to confirm exactly what happened, that it's really there when you need it. All right. The fourth feature is revision history. And this is a capability that in 2023 we took out of the traceability option and we standardized it within all of Bluehill Universal. So if you have version 4.42 or higher, then this is something that you'll see in the software. And what it is the change log of a particular Instron file, and it lives with that file. And so if you look on the screenshot here, if you were in a method, and if you look at your toolbar, that there's a button that looks like a stopwatch with a little arrow going backwards, and that's how you kind of go back in time to see all the different revisions. So if you click that, you will get a dialog that pops up and shows you the revision history associated to the file that you have open. So in this case, the file that I had open had been saved 20 different times. Um, and you can see that at this particular time, on the 20th revision, Dan was the user. And it shows you exactly what happened in that revision. So whether it's just one thing that changed or a list of 10 or 20 things that you'd see kind of a number of different rows underneath this. In this case, you'll see that the default folder that the output was getting pointed to changed. So it shows you what the new folder is, shows you what the previous folder was, and that this is kind of the one change associated to this revision. Um, and so this is shared for your method files, your report template files, your sample files that you'll see. Each file that is created will have a revision history associated to it. And the way this connects to the audit trail is that, yes, this revision history lives with the file. So you could pass it from one system to another, for instance, and you would see the history associated to that file as that file is transferred. But if you do make those changes, say revision 20 was made on my computer, that the audit trail entry would reflect the changes for that file within the audit trail as well. So the audit trail is kind of an all-inclusive, has everything, all files, all interaction with logging in, logging out, people trying to log in with invalid credentials, different system level actions, whereas revision history is kind of associated to each particular file. Um, and what it does is it gives you certainty of who, what, and when of every single change, which is not something what we could say 5 or 10 years ago when you're managing all of your Instron files that you depend on. Where because traditionally we're storing things in the Windows environment, you're making changes in Bluehill. You might change a particular calculation to try something out because you're seeing something a little bit strange in where a data point is being captured. You save it, and maybe you go to lunch and you come back, you don't realize what file you're using. The next person uses the system. They see that something changed because it looks like the file was saved 2 hours ago, even though you know you've been using this file for 5 years. But there was used to be no way of knowing what actually changed, who changed it. Um, and so this really connects all those dots quite nicely, and you don't have to think about it. It's just always there for you. Number 5 is taking those revisions to the next level. So there's one thing to actually just keep track of what people are changing with each revision. It's another to store all of those versions if you ever need to revert back to a particular file for whatever reason. So that's what we're going to talk about with number 5. And this does require Bluehill Central because Bluehill Central uses a SQL database to store files that are being shared across all of your equipment. And so when we are storing methods and samples on our database, that we aren't just overwriting that file every time like you would be doing in the Windows environment, that we're saving each revision. So what does that do? That allows us to be able to access previous revisions and revert back to an obsolete revision if necessary. So you have kind of an archive of every version. So what I'm showing on this particular screenshot is if you were to view the revision history for a particular file, whether you're in Bluehill Universal or Bluehill Central on a central connected system, that you'd be able to see each revision like we saw before. And now you could download it off the database if you need to for whatever reason. But it also allows us to say, hey, I the change that was approved to move to revision 20, um, we actually need to revert back. There was an unintended change, and you could simply revert back to a previous revision. Uh, Without this, what are you doing? You're kind of stuck looking at all of the changes that have been made between one revision and the one you want to go back to, and trying to manually go into the file and revert and like manually change all of those settings if you don't have access to the prior revision. So this is something that is quite nice and also enables us by storing other versions, some of the things that I'm about to talk about. So the next is read and write access. And similar to the last feature, this is something that is required, um, requires Bluehill Central's file system. So again, storing files on the SQL database that we use. And what read and write is, it basically allows you to configure users' access to open or to edit Instron files or folders. And it gives you greater flexibility to protect specific files and folders that you care about. So if we look at how you access these settings, again, if you were to select a particular file that lives on the database that's being shared across, whether you just have one piece of equipment or multiple pieces of equipment, that you can edit the attributes. Within those attributes, there's file access settings, and there's read and write access, where you can say that everyone, all users on the team that have access to that file are able to open it, are able to modify it. You could say no team members are allowed to open it or modify it, or you could have select team members where you're actually calling out individuals or multiple people who are able to modify that particular file. And this works hand in hand with security. So when we say all team members, they'd have to have the permission to be able to edit methods to actually write to it. You'd have to be able to run tests to be able to open that up as a sample. So it's working hand in hand with security, but it's adding an extra layer of flexibility to get very specific in protecting specific folders and specific files, where standard security are just blanket permissions. And so one way I like to, two examples of kind of demonstrating and talking that through is that your ability to control who can write to certain methods actually allows you to truly lock down the validated methods that you depend on. So without this functionality, that you can certainly enable security, and you can use our edit method permission to basically say, hey, these users are not allowed to make any method modifications. These users are allowed to make method modifications. But what that means is that anyone that you do assign edit method privileges, they can open up any method and make changes as they please. You can't parse through methods that they can and cannot edit. So this adds that layer of flexibility where if you're working on something, you don't want anyone else to be able to change it, or maybe the whole team has validated a particular method and no one should be making any changes to it, regardless of their permissions, that you can control the write access. And another case is on the operator and on the testing side, in that many of our labs that we work with, they're not just running the same exact test every single day, that they have a variety of different setups that they use the universal testing equipment to run. And some are simpler than others. And sometimes when operators enter that lab, they get trained incrementally, and they'll start on the more basic tests, and then they'll advance into more advanced testing. And Right now, if you set up security and you have operators with the ability to test specimens, that they can open up any method they want and they create data. Um, and there's definitely a desire to be able to control and monitor and limit what particular operators can run tests with particular methods. So in this case, you could control their ability to open certain methods, um, and then lock other methods from particular users. Okay, our next is file status, and this is again an extension of storing each each revision of a file on Bluehill Central's database. So this does require Bluehill Central. And what we're talking about when I'm bringing up file status is that each revision of a file stored in Central has a particular state. So whether it's the active revision being used, if it's a draft revision, if the revision is obsolete, or if it's something that's pending review. And those states will be clearly indicated in the revision history. So if you look in this example, revision 21 is actually a draft version that Dan was working on, which shows revision 20 is still the active version that if someone were to run a test, this is still the active revision. So testing can continue to occur while something is being drafted, while something is pending review, to not down kind of the system while that review process occurs. But really, that's one way this can help. Another way is just clear indication of if there is a draft available, um, knowing what you're opening, knowing what you're using is something that I think definitely promotes data integrity. And you can see that in this screenshot as someone is opening up a method file, maybe they're going to modify it, maybe they're going to create a test, that there's indication quite clearly that there's a draft that is available, that if a user does have the proper permissions, they would be able to run tests with that draft method. They would be able to access the draft to make additional modifications. Um, so we have, of course, clear indication of what revision is active, when there could be a draft present or a review that's ongoing. Like I said before, this allows you, if you do have signatures integrated into your Bluehill software, that if there's something pending review, you can continue to test with the active version. And then when we do have non-active versions available, so drafts, obsolete, things that are pending review, that if any of those are actually opened up to run a test, and there could be data collected, that we are now watermarking the testing workspace. So your graphs will show whether or not that's in a draft state. Same with the report template, that if you produce data, you have a PDF report, that the entire PDF report will be watermarked with the state if it's not that active version, just to make it very clear that that method was in kind of a non-approved active state when the data was collected. So that's file status. And our final feature that I wanted to talk about today, it deviates from the central, the last couple of features that I was talking about. And this is version traceability. And this is a really simple thing to turn on, that I find, again, a lot of our users aren't aware of some of the metadata that's available for you to put onto your report just to have better traceability of the test that was performed and the kind of the system that was present to perform that test. And what we're looking at here ultimately is on your test report. And actually you can see, like I was talking about, I had done this on a method that was in a draft state. So you could see what that watermark would look like ultimately if the method was in draft. But what I've highlighted is are some things that I think everyone should put into their method parameters into the body of their report templates. So stuff like who the user was that ran the test, what the name of the method was, the revision of the method, maybe when the method was last saved, and then even the Bluehill Universal software version. So these are things that can come in pretty handy if you're trying to compare data from different tests 3 or 4 years down the line to just have some of that basic information. It is always there. And where you can add this is that if you go into your test method to exports, that if you navigate to your report area, that there's by default, it's going to jump onto the setup tab. But if you jump over to the method parameter tab, that you'll see this big long list of available parameters that you can add as essentially method parameters to your report. And I just want to highlight that the general tab, if you kind of scroll down to general, that there's a lot of useful information. All of these things that I just demonstrated are all under the general tab. And so you can pick the ones that you think are useful. And the only other trick that you got to do is make sure that your method parameters are actually included in the body of your report template. So you'd go over to the report tab to look at your report template settings. And when you navigate to what content lives in the body, you just make sure your method parameters are included, and then you'll get this nice list of information. And a lot of times people like to have other batch information associated to that sample in addition to this kind of more generic stuff. But again, just a good reminder to add those things. Okay, those were all 8 features that I wanted to cover today. So hopefully you heard something that you hadn't heard before, maybe something you'll be able to implement right away. Certainly, if there's stuff revolving around traceability or central that you want more information about or want to speak with us specific about how you think it could be useful for you and maybe questions that you might have, always reach out uh, through normal channels. So whether it's to your sales rep, your service rep, or just in response to this webinar, we can find you the right resource. So let's just jump into the Q&A. And I see there was just one question that was, or maybe a couple questions that were entered live. So the first question that I see is, does the audit trail include user access level info? That is the group that they are assigned to, such as the operator, mechanic, engineer, administrator. So what the audit trail includes is going to be dependent on your security mode, but certainly any changes to the security and user permissions that are occurring on the system are going to get recorded in the audit trail. So if you're using Bluehill Security and you create a new user, that when you create that new user, you're going to give them a name, you're going to assign all of the different permissions, the role that they're associated to. Like to your point, we have some pre-canned roles. All of those selections are going to be rolled up into the creation of that user in an audit entry when they are created. If at any point in time someone goes in and modifies a permission associated to that new user, then you're going to have another entry associated to that timestamp of what was changed with their permissions. If you do have Active Directory, same thing when you're setting up Active Directory at first, you're going to have kind of your initial settings of what user groups are assigned to what permissions. And if you have changes that occur where you're saying that a different user group is to be assigned a particular permission, or you're removing access from a particular user group, then those changes to how each permission is mapped to a user group would be caught in the audit trail. There's a question about does file protection encrypt the Bluehill test file, or does it remain a plain text XML that can be edited outside of Bluehill? So the Instron data sample files, the method files are encrypted, and they are monitored for disruptions. And so that if there's modification that does occur, that it would be flagged by the application as the application interacts with that particular file. So it also is a little bit different depending on if you're storing things in Central versus you're storing things in Windows as to who has access to the location where they're stored. But plain answer is yes. Encryption is certainly something that we take seriously. It's something that, as you're looking at a lot of it's coming and originating out of the European Union, but there's different regulations between the Cyber Security Resilience Act, the CRA, or a machinery regulation. That a lot of these regulations that are coming in the next year to 2 years are hyper focused on cybersecurity around and what encryption algorithms are allowed versus aren't allowed. Um, and so I guess for that particular person, if there's anything else you're curious about, let us know and we can get more specific offline. Another question is, my question about the audit trail was more about how an auditor would know what level of access to list. Okay, so good clarifying question. Anytime that if you wanted to check a particular user what their access is, that there are a couple ways of doing that. Let me, at first, I can just pull up so that if you have Bluehill security, I can just show you what that looks like. So if you go into our, I'm showing an example with Bluehill Central, but it would be relatively similar for if you did not have Central, where you're going to see each of your users and their permissions. So you would just come here, go to a particular user and show what they have access to do and what they don't have access to do. If you have Active Directory, it's going to look a little bit different. What it's going to look like is if I go back to the very first feature, that your permissions are going to look like this. They're mapped to user groups. So to be able to prove what that user can and can't do, if you're not going to physically run through all of the actions to prove that, which we do when we're IQOQing or validating the system, that you would have to go to those user groups on your AD domain and show what user lives within each user group. So you can kind of go on to the AD controller to look at how the construction of those user groups have been managed, or you could kind of just demonstrate it in practice and have them show that they're not able to delete something, exclude something, whereas someone else might be able to do that. Okay. Another question we have is, will this also allow to see how long a method was in use for a single time? For example, will it track what time I opened a file and then when I closed the file? So in the simple answer is no. There's nothing that says that, say, a user accesses a method, they open it up, and then they close it. If someone opens and then closes something and makes no changes, then the audit trail won't actually show anything associated to that because there's no change recorded to actually track as a new revision. There won't be a new revision. It won't live. That interaction with that file will not live on the audit trail or in revision history. If they open it, make a change, and then close it, the time at which they press save, so probably around the time that they close it, is the time that's going to be associated to that revision and that audit entry. Um, One thing that I will add in I don't maybe this person is this is the perspective they're coming from, that if you are trying to understand maybe that from a with a test sample, so someone creates a new sample file because they're running tests, that in that case, the time between when they're running their first test and their last test is something that can be recorded and captured. So whether you want to put that on your results table or you want to put that in kind of that header method parameter table as to when every test started or when every test stopped, that is information that you can have for the history of how long it took for to run. If you say you have 10 tests to run, maybe it happened all consecutively within an hour, or maybe that took 3 or 4 days to run those 10 tests. And so that's something you can add. Question, can the user list and their permission level be exported to Excel? Currently, that is not a capability that we allow. Okay. So I think that is looks like all the questions that we've looks like we've gone through all of them. But again, if anything comes up, you know where to reach me. You know who I am. Hopefully, you have some good contacts for Instron, and we'll make sure we can answer any questions that you have. But with that, I'll pass things back off to Nick.
All right. Thank you, Dan. So before everyone charges out the door here, I just have a few quick notes. In the moments between right now and when we end the webinar, if you decide you have a question and put it into the Q&A, I will make sure to get that over to Dan so he can follow up with you. And a reminder that this session was recorded, so I'm going to make sure that everyone gets a copy of that recording over the next couple days. And then for any of you that do work with plastics in the automotive industry, we have a webinar coming up on June 16th that you may be interested in. I'm going to drop a link into the chat now. That's the registration page. You can see all of the other plastics related webinars that we have coming up throughout the rest of this year. We have, I think, 4 others in the lineup for the rest of the year for live sessions. And then one of them was just a couple of weeks ago. That session is available on demand on that same page. So head on over there to get signed up and check out the session descriptions. And then finally, a short survey will appear once this webinar ends. We would really appreciate your thoughts. So with that, thank you to our presenter, Dan, and thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate your time. Take care, everybody.